So we've been studying the lost tribes, and it is a look into when the Bible closes. And specifically, I don't want to just say the Old Testament, but when the Bible closes and there's no more to be added, don't think that somehow God went silent and he's no more to be heard from. In fact, what I love about this series is as we begin to follow the people migrating, and if you're looking, for example, in some of the apocryphal books and some of the other materials, you find right there where it says they would go into a land where no man had dwelt before, that they'd go to lands far to the east, far to the west. So there's enough information there to say we're laying down a foundation. It's a gargantuan task. I actually appreciate a lot of your patience, because a lot of times I'm just trying to dump enough information to then come back and try and figure out if you got the nuts and bolts of the dump, maybe now I can go back and I can micro detail what's happening. Because as I said, there's so much information. We started by following or looking at the tribe of Dan, and we have definitely seen that Dan will possibly line up with a few other tribes, a few other people and cultures outside of the house of Israel. But what I've said before regarding these people who originally, tribe of Dan, as one of the many children, offspring of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel. And of course, if you're studying the Old Testament, we see that by the time of the Exodus out of Egypt, Dan is still there because they're set up strategically in the camp of all the tribes. Their tents are set up strategically. But we know that there were several exoduses before that exodus. And this becomes important because a timeline has to be established. Now, when we get to looking at the history of Ireland, the history of Ireland would not really exist. Were there people in Ireland before the Firbolgs or before the Numidians or before the Tuatha De Danann? Yes. And we have evidence for that. If all you have to do is look at the land that is peppered with these ginormous stones, these incredible thousands of pounds, tons stones that we know come well before any of these people have set foot in that land. But that's a story for a different day. We're looking at these people in particular who belong to what we're calling the lost house or the lost tribe of Israel. So were there people there? Yes. But what is interesting is I referenced a people called the Firbolgs. Now those people, and I think I failed to say this, those people are on the Emerald Isle. They are there, and we don't know where they come from, but actually we do. They were enslaved. They were actually part of a first group of people who fled. It may have been along the lines at the same time either of Dan in its first initial leaving Egypt before the children of Israel went into bondage. And what we have there is we have these people that get enslaved somewhere in the Greek Isles. They free themselves, they flee, they find that land, they settle there. So make no mistake when I say that when there are successive waves of people landing there, and it happens, we're not talking about close together in close proximity, that the next people who land there, for example, if it's the Numidians, they don't know if they're related to these people. And by the time the Tuatha De Danann will land, the tribe of Dan will land and encounter the Firbolgs in Ireland, they will not know that that's their kin. So if you can even imagine this, and while we talk about people being killed by war of every kind, these are people that just landed and ensued basically, it's either conquer or be conquered. And part of that conquering included killing. So there's a pattern of that And we'll see ultimately the final people to land in Ireland, who I've mentioned, the Milesians. This is where there's a lot of difficulty because there's so much ambiguity around these particular people that we'll have to kind of walk this back a little bit, perhaps in this lesson, maybe in the next one, not quite sure. But what is strange is we do have a record before the Firbolgs arrived in Ireland. Remember, we're still talking about people who are identified as belonging to the tribe of Dan, no matter what nomenclature you're going to call them by. But the first one who we know of is Part de Leon. And here's what's really bizarre. It is stated in several different records that Part de Leon landed there with 8 people, including himself, 4 men and 4 women, having passed through the dangers beyond the Pillars of Hercules after the flood. Now, I do not want to tell you that this is Noah because I don't believe it is. However, I find that as I search, I'm finding more allusions to biblical material than previously ever seen. Here's a man who, with 8 souls on board, according to this legend, begins to colonize that area after the flood. And you tell me that doesn't sound like biblical Noah to you. So there's always these strange parallels, but we know that these people were like rabbits. They were repopulating. They were taking a commission of some kind real seriously. They were repopulating like rabbits. So we know that a plague hit the Firbolgs, and about 9,000 immediately were wiped out in this plague. Then eventually, as I said, we have the Tuatha De Danann that arrived, the tribe of Dan that arrived, and some very interesting things are said about them. Again, if you're reading other materials, you might find that they were accused of being wizards and witches, and they were accused of necromancy. Well, none of that is true. The truth is that they were, the Tuatha De Danann, the tribe of Dan, were so advanced as a culture. They had, because of their exposure to the Philistines, to the Phoenicians, they had knowledge about glass blowing. I mean, talk about early concepts that we can't even wrap our minds around. They had different techniques that nowadays we'd say, well, that's a given, but back then had not yet been seen. So if you can imagine, for example, lighting a fire without having to rub wood together, or how to get a fire started, and they developed a technique to start a fire without doing that. Of course, you'd look like a wizard or a magician in that day. No way that this could be something that every human being would eventually learn and know and do, right? So they were accused of a lot of things, not true, but they did have great wisdom. And of course, their wisdom is even unmatched to the people that come after them, the Milesians. And this is quite interesting because here is where there is a big split. I'll just tell you now, and then maybe we can sort it out. There's no way, as a person, I'd like to call myself a time detective here, there's no way to go back and adequately figure this out because we don't have enough information, except for the DNA evidence, to figure out where exactly these Milesian people really actually came from. And the reason why I say this is a problem, because if you are looking at the names, again, if you're reading different materials, a man named Meled, Melisius, and possibly either his son, Gethelius or Gethelus, it's assumed that these must be of Spanish descent because they were living in Spain, but they were not of Spanish descent. We know that. We know that they had to come from somewhere in the Levant, the Holy Land area. Okay, we know that. But where there is no agreement, and I'll tell you, when I have an opinion, I tell you what the opinion is. My opinion is that, I said this at the very beginning, the Milesians are none other than a descendant from the tribe of Judah. And if you look carefully, you'll find an individual named Mahol in the records, M-A-H-O-L. I'm almost inclined to believe that this Mahol may actually be the key to figuring out who the Malaysians are, but that's something so minute and probably so irrelevant. But if you're like me, you can hit a wall somewhere and you can say, it doesn't make sense, there's contradictions here, what do I do? Park it, put it aside, don't get hung up on it, because eventually more information comes that brings a little bit more clarity. So hold that thought right there. Now, back to these people in Ireland. We know that the Tuatha De Danann, when they landed, they fought the Firbolgs for 4 days. The king, their Firbolg king, was killed in battle, and a man named Sreng, who was the most formidable Firbolg warrior, he maimed the king of the Tuatha De Danann, whose name I believe is Nauda. In English would be Nauda or Naida. They cut off his hand. And just listen to how strange this is. He was not allowed to rule anymore because he was maimed. Now, that's only strange if you know about Hebrew customs and what it would take for someone to be put in the position of being a ruler. If you had some defect, you could not rule. So it's interesting that they remove him. They actually make him a silver prosthetic hand, and he gets a little nickname of Silver Hand. Go figure that. I couldn't have seen that one coming, right? But the man who rules in his stead for 7 years is so evil and so corrupt. He is not an overseer of the people. He doesn't care about his tribe. He's only interested in, he really is the stereotype that Hollywood is portrayed as more of a barbaric type. And so, hated enough, he eventually flees. He goes to the Hybrids, or the Hebrides, and raises up his own army to come back and attack his own kin. Nice guy. In the process, they reinstate Silverhand. So old Silverhand is back ruling because there's no king. But when this Breus comes back, just to show you, I'm trying to paint the picture of what type of mentality they had. He comes back and he has no issue to kill the king, which he does, and a big slaughter incurs. There's not even a thought that they are fighting their own blood. Now you might say, well, what's the difference between that and, for example, the American Civil War? We were all brothers basically fighting, but again, the difference there may be about the political understanding and the laws of the land at the time in America. This was simply about a power play. There wasn't some, we have a difference of opinion of who can be and who can't be. It was just simply kill or be killed, and that's exactly what happened. So after this time, just to give you an idea of how things can work out, they put a man in power who becomes their next king by the name of Dagda. He rules for 80 years and is considered one of the greatest of the tribe of Dan in terms of all the people that led. And apparently they had many kings within their realm until the Milesians came, and then the Milesians basically will dominate the tribe of Dan. And the tribe of Dan will never get its traction back again. It's kind of done. So this is another one of these I have to explain. I'm going to give you a little synopsis of something I shared with you last week, and I'm going to try to elaborate a little bit on it. We know, as I'm talking about the Milesians, we know that these are a varied people that started somewhere from Egypt, made their way through Turkey, Greece, and onward to Spain, and eventually into Ireland. But there is a story that says that these known as Gael, because in the days of their ancestors who were living at the time of Moses, one named Godal Glas. It is said that Moses cured him of a snake bite, and Neul, grandson of Gadol or Gadhal, who had been invited as an instructor to Egypt by one of the pharaohs, married Pharaoh's daughter named Skoda, and this is how it's packaged. And then all the people after they went to Ireland were named Skoda after her. No, that's not how it happened. That is the fabrication of monks who either didn't have enough learning in the Bible and thought that was a convenient way to perpetuate Scotland. Scotland doesn't even start like that. Sorry, if you don't know the history of that, go read it somewhere. That's not the history. What we do know is, and this is where the problem begins, this name Niall, which I'm sure morphs into the Irish Neil, which is a very popular name, but in its spelling simply is translated as champion. So whoever this Niall is, Niall, grandson of Godot, this could have been a way of saying a great champion, a great warrior, may not even be a true name. But here's what's so crazy about this. A story is told that, if you know the biblical timeline, can never add up to this. If you believe the story that I just referenced, that here is a man invited as instructor into Egypt by one of the pharaohs, married Pharaoh's daughter named Skoda, and maybe that happened, but these are not related. That the fact that afterwards the people are called Scotia and then later it's called Scotland in Scotland, no. What is entirely plausible is that if you know the timeline, the episode that they're talking about, Moses curing somebody of a snake bite, happens in Numbers after they're still wandering, but it's after they've left Egypt. And if you follow the story as told, where it says this man who went back who was a champion, there's a disconnect. And the disconnect is, it says he went back to Egypt while they had already left Egypt. And so there's one problem in that story. You might say, well, what are you trying to imply here? Well, I'm going to tell you what I'm trying to imply. I'm trying to tell you that there are actually several stories tied up like a spider's web that we have to untangle. Because the other part of the story, and I'm jumping ahead of myself and my notes, but the other side of the story is the arrival of Jeremiah, the prophet, along with the daughters of Zedekiah and the scribe Baruch in Ireland. And here's where it gets a little confusing, okay? So bear with me. We know, based on the book of Jeremiah, you read starting in the latter chapters of 30 and 40, in the 40s of Jeremiah, and you'll read how Jeremiah was summoned to King Zedekiah to advise him. Of course, he didn't take the advice. We're now talking about this is southern kingdom, Judah. And we know that there's a prophecy given that says they will be carried away into Babylon for 70 years. Now what happens is Zedekiah, who is not a good king, he tries basically to work a deal and make an alliance or an allegiance with an Egyptian pharaoh. That call kind of falls on deaf ears, because what's told is Nebuchadnezzar's coming and Jerusalem is going to fall. Now, that's kind of the gist of it, okay? How the story goes is, as Jeremiah counsels Zedekiah and tells him what to do, Zedekiah, who should have just stayed true to God's word, he makes a promise to the Babylonian leader, and then he takes it back. And that unleashes the beast on him, okay? So, Zedekiah is taken away. His eyes are plucked out. He's got a fish hook in his jaw, and he's led away. Basically, all of his male heirs are killed or imprisoned. And his daughters escape with Jeremiah and the scribe Baruch. The first place that they go, and you can read it in here, it's in the Bible, they flee to Egypt. Now, why is this important? Because, again, we're going to combine Bible and archaeology and some evidence that it's really hard to debate this when you see it. You might think, well, okay, they fled to Egypt, and where did they go? Well, we know where they went. They went to the palace of Afris, or the pharaoh Hofra. they show up there. And why, you ask? Well, if you read this record in Jeremiah very carefully, you're going to find, and there's records of it elsewhere, I believe it might be in either Kings or Chronicles, but you'll read very clearly that Zedekiah had some type of, we'll call it at least an amicable relation with Hophra. So we have the daughters of the king of Judah showing up at Pharaoh's door. He takes them in. He hides them because the rumor was that the Babylonians are now going to invade Egypt. So he takes them in for a time, but they must flee. And here's what's kind of baffling. The records, both secular and not, there's no record of it, I do not believe in the Bible, but there are secular records that say that Pharaoh Hophra adopted the daughters of Zedekiah so that they would, A, have his protection, and B, they would not be without status, because let's face it, if they were just simply princesses and they didn't have anything else tied to them, it's not like they have standing anywhere. Now, as the record goes, I believe this would have been in the 1880s, early 1900s, when they were excavating the palace of Hophra. They found an inscription there. And the inscription reads, the palace, I wish I would actually read it to you the way it properly reads. Kisir bint El Yehudihi, palace of the daughter of Judah. Okay? So I don't know what you want to do with that. You could say, well, somebody put that there by accident. Okay? Here's what we do know. We don't know about how many people were with them, only that the daughters, plural, of Zedekiah, Jeremiah, and the scribe. Now, were there other people? There had to have been other people. But I want you to see this very carefully. What we do know, the stone that is called the stone of destiny or the stone of scone, that stone was with them. That is the stone, if you're not familiar with this, that is the stone that Jacob laid his head upon when he saw the image of the angels going up and down the ladder. And he said, surely God was in this place and I knew it not. That stone purportedly got transported until the time of this time, and they brought that stone with them. And I'm imagining that stone's probably of a decent weight. Now, the other part of this is legend, I believe. And the legend says that they also brought the Ark of the Covenant with them. Now, the reason why I do not think so is, can you imagine, first of all, the Ark of the Covenant had to have some weight to it, okay? I don't know if anybody remembers or wants to guess about the approximate weight of the Ark, but I highly doubt that an old man, actually 2 elderly men and 2 young women, maybe a couple of other people with them, I highly doubt that they were carrying this thing properly, by the way, through the poles and everything like you're supposed to do, while they're running and they're hiding. Yeah, let's go. No one will see us. Yeah, all right, making good progress here, right? Don't think so. I don't think that's the way it happened, okay? I just don't. I'm sorry. In fact, I don't even believe that part of the story is true for many other reasons. As I've said before, we can pick apart the Bible, but there is no ark in Ezekiel's temple, and I believe there is reason for that, so let's leave that one alone. I don't believe that happened. But here's where it gets confusing. If the daughters of Zedekiah were adopted by Pharaoh, and they may have actually borne Egyptian names, just like Joseph. Joseph he was given an Egyptian name as well, okay? So it's possible that one of the daughters, say maybe their name given by Pharaoh was Skoda. And that's possible because the legend has it, but it's not. You'll see why in a minute. Because the legend has it that these people took off then, whether you want to call it, let's just say Zedekiah's daughters, Jeremiah and the scribe, and maybe a few others, and they took off and they set sail. We know that when they set sail, and there's actually a chronicle of this. Why? Because they had a scribe with them. Hello. And that's what scribes do, is they write, okay? So whether they're copying or they're writing, it doesn't matter. That's what they do. So we know that they departed from Egypt. They hit very bad weather. Their ship suffered damage. They actually stayed in the estuary of Tiber, just outside of Rome for a while. Then they set on their journey, and once they left the estuary of Tiber, they hit a really bad storm. Their ship was badly damaged. And word came just before they got to Spain, I'm going to use the proper word, that some royalty was coming, but no one knew. It was kind of a word that had just circulated. Who knows how that happened? They get to Spain, which is not yet Spain, and the descendants there, which I told you are many, these are many of tribal people of the house of Israel, specifically, as I said, possibly the tribe of Gad and others. They declare Teotephi, who is the daughter of Zedekiah, they declare her queen. They declare her queen of the people. That's even before she gets to Ireland. And then, of course, they get their ship repaired. I believe they did that somewhere in a place called Mara Zion by Cornwall. And by the time they arrived there, the high-ranking officials knew of who she was. And that leads you to, they finally arrive in Ireland, and the story goes on. Here's the problem. Two parallel stories. One has the story of Newell, grandson of Gedol, who marries Skoda. But I want you to think about this. If Moses cured, let's say, the dad, and the son is now taking off and marrying a daughter of Pharaoh, the timeline is not adequate. There's not enough time, because the events we're looking at that truly transpired happened in after 586 BC. In the time of Moses, there's not enough time for that. So that's why I said sometimes you have to look at these things and recognize that this could just be a messed up kind of one of those mythological meldings of stories that over time just kind of get stuck there. Or the other preference that I'd like to say is that a lot of times it was the uneducated monks and people living in what we'll call the very dark ages, who did not even read, let alone have access to scripture, who fabricated a lot of these things. So good luck to you in sorting that out, but I just thought I would tell you that I'm not done. We'll come back to this because this is a big subject. But here's what I want to now get back to. The parallel story is that Milid, or Melisius, who also, by the way, is with a daughter of Pharaoh, is dispatched and goes out to the isle. If you look this up, you'll see there's at least 2 or 3 people who take up with a Pharaoh's daughter or an adopted daughter of Pharaoh. Maybe that's a popular custom, and I didn't know it, right? Don't think so. So what we do know is that this Milid, whoever Milid is, who is probably the leader of the Milesians, it says that he died in Spain. He never even made it to Ireland. But he had 8 sons and their mother, and so 5 of the sons were lost. That means 3 landed in Ireland with the mother, and that would be, by the way, at a separate time too. So none of these things can be looked at except on a timeline to understand the impossibility. Now, why am I saying all this and saying impossible for the first story I just told? I'll tell you why. Because the promise given early on by the patriarch Jacob Israel is that there would always be a descendant of David sitting on the throne. And not to be confused, I typed this up to show you something. Yes, I typed it up myself. This is a line from Zerah. So I've got Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Israel, Judah. And this is Zerah's line, and the line descending from Zerah and all of its descendants. And I went to Charlemagne, all right? So from Zerah, you could trace this all the way down. It's actually a real pain to do it, but you can trace all of this. But the reason why I'm showing you this is because not to be confused with the line that descends from Pharez. remember, that produces David, that produces Solomon, the kings of Israel, that will produce, by the way, the line that leads down to Zedekiah, that will keep going. But hold that thought for a minute, because it's important to recognize how separate these lines are. Don't homogenize the line of Zerah and the line of Pharez and put them together, not just yet. That comes a little bit later. They'll get put back together. But for right now, for what we're talking about right now, it's important to note that if we were trying to follow someone sitting on the throne of David, and they had taken this stone of destiny before its time, it means a lot of things, but it means it's impossible. Because the first story I told you would have them leaving wherever they were in the wilderness, sometime in a generation or so in Moses' day, and we would have never even gotten to producing or choosing David as king. Does that all make sense to you? That's why sometimes you have to do things backwards, and it sounds a little bit convoluted, but you've got to approach it from a deduction backwards to recognize that first theory cannot work. Now, the stone was brought to Ireland, and there's a whole story about the stone, which I'll get to in a minute. But what I want to point out to you is we know that there are several leaders involved from the Bible record. We can trace, for example, if you go back to the record in Chronicles that I've pointed out so many times, First Chronicles, I believe 2, and you've got the line of Judah, Judah's family record, and I want you to take a look at something. Sons of Pharez, Hezron and Hamul, sons of Zerah, Zimri, or Zabdi, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Dara, which I've said many times, or Darda, as the margin reads, 5 of them in all. It is my opinion, just my opinion, that if you remember, we have Calcol, or Chalcol, leaves to Greece. I believe Gethelus is the son of Chalcol, and Gethelus actually returns to Egypt briefly. So the dad flees, he has kids somewhere, the kid comes back to Egypt for a time, and I believe we can more than put this together to show that a descendant of Chalcol named Gethelus is also in the line of the Milesians. So let's not try and smear this too much. As I said, we're kind of doing a time detective thing with little information, so it makes it very difficult. But what we do know is that once the Milesians are ruling, we will have 2 individuals who are actually brothers, Hiramon and Heber, and I don't think that's an accident either, that if you look, you'll find a lot of names everywhere with the HBR, Hibernia, all of those names that certainly they either come from this individual's name or they're coming from Eber in that line of genealogies that is in Noah's line. Look it up. But we have these 2 brothers that will eventually fight. Hiramon, one of the brothers, wins. It's during this particular time that we're starting to see a flux of other people coming into the land. A lot of Pictish people will show up. This is after the Milesians are there. And what's interesting is everything is interconnected. Don't think they're separate things. The Pictish chiefs arrive and they are given wives that are of Milesian, either Danish or Milesian descent. And they are told, take them to Alba, Scotland. Under one condition, that you adhere to the laws of the birth being established, or the entity of the child, nowadays I guess you could say it like that, as the practice female line of succession, meaning everything is determined upon the mother. So I think that's interesting. Why? Because there's another Hebrew trait that comes out. Kind of interesting. And all of these are strange little, you can say strange little coincidences, but are they really? Okay. What do the Milesians bring to the table? Well, probably not too much. They take credit for being the first to smelt gold, but I don't think that's true. They introduced gold ornaments. I don't think that's true either, because gold ornaments we know existed in Egypt and elsewhere long before these people. And various clothing for various colored clothing, which I also don't think is true, because just think of Jacob or Joseph and his multicolored coat. These are not inventors of too much, by the way. I think they're squatters more than anything, but they claim to have invented a lot, so just so you know. All right, then there is this, and I'm circling back to this. Olam Fadla, who is the blessed leader for 40 years, purportedly, 7 or 8 centuries before Christ. Now, most biblical scholars say this is Jeremiah. And I got to tell you, if you are really looking at what this Olam Fadla did when he arrived, it's quite remarkable, because he made structure in the land, dividing up, what we have now, what might be analogous to states or provinces, and then townships or parishes. He divided up everything so that the reason being is then he appointed overseers over those areas, that every 3 years at something called the Feast of Tara, where they would gather together and they would discuss and resolve the problems from each parish or each township. And you don't think that has a biblical ring to it when you realize, for example, when Moses set up people to be overseers, there's all of these parallels. I'm sorry, but you can't help but look at this and say, well, there's really strong evidence. But the greater evidence to look at is this person who arrived, who many people have wrongly identified. I've heard all kinds of crazy stuff, that this must be David. Well, how could David be ruling and fighting the Philistines and all the battles he fought and fleeing from Saul and hiding in a cave and be ruling for 40 years in Ireland? I'd like to see that happen, but I don't think that's so. All right, so there's a lot of things. If you're trying to sort this out on your own, don't get too frustrated. It can be like, I'm going to pull out my hair. What we do know is that, first of all, Tara and the hill of Tara was there before Teotephai, the daughter of Zedekiah, got there. And I do not think, again, it's an accident that the hill of Tara, remember, language didn't necessarily come with vowels, all right? Especially if you are from the Semitic branch. So I want you to think that the hill of Tara could have very easily been the hill of Torah. There's all possibilities. There's nothing that's impossible here. As I said, Ireland has been called many things by many people. Hibernia, used by Caesar. Some trace the name to Ivernia, but you should remember the first settlers of the Milesian branch were known at least to the southern half of the island as Eber or Heber, not Milesians. That's another one of these, how do you get that, right? If it's that whole area is peppered with, from Spain, from the Hebrides, from the Ebro River, you've got all of these names that take you back to one concept, Hebrew. Coincidence? I don't know. Eire, E-I-R-E, Ireland, was the name the Northmen and then the Saxon would use to identify the land beginning in the 9th and 10th century. Ir, I-R, land, or Ireland, that became Ireland. Aristotle in his time referred to this land as Urnia. The Latins would refer to it either as Hibernia or Scotia. And as I said, these are important things because there's something else that needs to be said on the account of this story I told you about Skoda. If anything, I would tell you, attach to this the fact, if you remember, we talked about the sons of Isaac, the Sakasuni, that are also called Scythian, that are also called Skulthoi, Skuth. And when I look at Skoda, I can't help but thinking that I also see that Skuth the concept is there, depending on how it was spelt. So this could also have just been indicative, not so much of a person's name, but basically of where they derive from or what tribe they associated with. Just keep that in your mind because, again, we're dealing with a good deal of ambiguity here. Ptolemy produced a map in the 2nd century that, for the most part of that land, is quite accurate. He identified over 16 tribes living in the land, and what is so mind-boggling, there is an actual map that was copied from that map, and it's kind of mind-boggling that you'd have that much accuracy, not only just of the land itself, but of the tribes living there. And the tribes and their tribal names, if you have time, look it up. It's a good revelation on understanding that names mean something. So you can start looking up the names and see this is son of. For example, we are familiar with terms like McMaster. But that would be son of a master. Or, I mean, there's a ton of these names that aren't really Smith. Smith is not necessarily a name, but it was a vocation. So you might have McSmith, son of the Smith. And you start looking at these and you start realizing it is more than just breadcrumbs. There's a lot of information there on that map, which I hope eventually to get to. Let me debunk one more thing while I'm on a roll for being hated. And that was, this is what the Catholic Church likes to perpetuate, and it really just irks me. Because here's the thing, if you're going to tell history, at least try and be accurate. I realize that we can't always be 100% accurate because there's missing information. But if you don't know it, zip it, right? So what they did is the story gets perpetuated that St. Patrick brought Christianity to the Emerald Isle in 432 AD, and the answer is no, okay? We know that a year before St. Patrick is recorded coming to the Emerald Isles, a man named Palladius was there before preaching in Christian congregations, but Vincentius of Beauvais wrote that James, the son of Zebedee, preached in Ireland, and that when he returned to Jerusalem, he was martyred, taking with him 7 Irish disciples. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Nicephorus, in his ecclesiastical history, says Simon the Zealot brought the gospel to these islands, where he was crucified later in Britain. And we know that the Apostle Paul was not only in Britain, but in Spain, as well as these lands. We've got other witnesses, for example, Joseph of Arimathea. We know that he was traveling to and from those mines somewhere in Cornwall. Well, there's no reason why he wouldn't have gone beyond those. And whether he ends up in the south of France with Mary Magdalene, or whether he, during that time, before they fled from that land, was busy preaching, which I believe he was. So, but if you don't believe anything I'm saying there's one really hardcore piece of information, and that is the church councils themselves. So the Council of Arles in 314 AD has British, English bishops in attendance with a peppering of the Irish. So you can put all of that St. Patrick stuff in a bag and do whatever you want with it, but as for me, listen, it's really fanciful to say, oh, he brought Christianity to the Isles, because it's their way of usurping Christianity, but it didn't happen like that. And in fact, if we could really know, I'm not sure whether Simon the Zealot or whether it's James the son of Zebedee, but I guarantee you at least one of the followers of Christ, eyewitness to Jesus, at least one of them, because we know they went to far-flung corners of the earth. If John, for example, went to India, that's where we get the Thomas went to India, that's where we get the Thomas Christians. We've got records of people basically going to far-flung corners to preach before they're martyred. So the idea somehow that this only belongs to the Catholic Church, and by the way, in 432, if you really want to go AWOL on this, all you got to do is start looking at the transmission of the New Testament as it is being spread. And we know for a fact that the Latin Vulgate, Jerome's Vulgate, we've got good sources to show, with dating, to show that these materials were spreading quickly and before 432, most certainly. Languages were already developed. Ophelius wrote and developed Gothic. We have the Armenian bishop who creates the Armenian language, all this in the 300s and 400s for the gospel. You think somehow the Irish people in that island, they waited and they said, oh, well, we'll wait until St. Patrick comes to visit us. I don't think it happened that way. So, what else can I tell you? I have a lot of information here that probably is, I would say, too much information and an overload. But here's what I do want to share with you that will kind of give some credence to something. Let me circle back to Tia-Tephi. So, the reason why I believe that Tia-Tephi fled from Egypt and made her way to Ireland, but before in Egypt was adopted by Pharaoh Khafra is this one thing, and this one thing only. In the 1950s, there is a hill called the Wailing Hill, or the Hill of Tara, and close by to that hill, they dug up a man, Sean O'Riordan, I believe is his name, is an Irish archaeologist, dug up in 1955, dug up and found the body of a young teenage boy. Remember, Tia-Tephi had 4 sons. The first one was a teenager and died and was buried there in that land. They unearthed, and what they find is the skeleton of a teenage boy, and he is decorated with a very large Egyptian beaded necklace. And they trace that necklace, the fabrication, everything about it, back to Khafra. And you tell me that this is just some magical made-up fairy tale and that some teenage boy liked necklaces and wore one while he was killed and ended up in a grave somewhere, and it just happened like that. Do you see what I'm saying? When you start looking at the evidence like that, you have to start saying, okay, there's elements to this that seem quite fanciful, but there are other things that are irrefutable. Now, the only thing I don't know, and I'm curious to know, it will be my next step to look into, is if they did DNA analysis on the boy. That was my big question. I couldn't find it anywhere, and I know I have a special site that I have to go to for this. But my guess is that the DNA will confirm what the necklace already says, that this indeed was Tia-Tephi's son buried there on that hill, and whether or not she married, which I believe she did marry one of the kings of that land, and she became both queen to those who made her that, the Gadites, and then later on of the people of that land. But you can talk about all of the fanciful things if you like, but the stone that they brought and the evidence of what this boy was wearing, these are 2 things that are very hard to ignore. Now, to the stone, and then I'm done. We know that the stone, according to legend, says that they brought it with them. And very interestingly enough, that this stone would have to be a part of most ceremonies, most high ceremonies, including coronation. We know that the stone was loaned to Fergus, the brother of Murdoch, king of Ireland, who had immigrated to Scotland, wanted the stone to be crowned king of the Irish who had settled there, but became Scottish. He wanted the stone, took it with him. The stone was not returned, but stayed in Scotland, where it became known as the Stone of Destiny. And then, of course, all Scottish kings were crowned upon it until 1296 AD. When Edward I of England invaded Scotland, he defeated the Scots, took the stone, and took it back. But here's the thing. Now, I don't know this, and I can't tell you because there's also great debate about this, whether the stone is the copy or not, who knows? The stone of Scone versus the stone of destiny, I don't know, and I'm not going to tell you that I even profess to know. But up until George VI, we know that people used this stone to be for their coronation. We know that it was reportedly said that it was used in Queen Elizabeth's coronation in 1953 as well. Who knows if it'll be used in King Charles? If that ever happens, who knows? We'll have to see about that. And I don't even know that we would see it because, by the way, it's placed under the chair upon which the newly crowned king or queen shall sit, and usually that chair is covered with regalia-type vestment, so you probably won't be able to see it. But that has been part of the monarchy So you have to ask yourself, if this stone didn't come here by way of Tia Tephi, what stone is this? And who cares about a stone from anywhere, for that matter, if it's just a stone? Now, I think maybe the only thing I've done today is sort out some fuzziness and maybe create some more fuzziness somewhere else as we're trying to track these people. But at least I know this. When God said that there will not be a time when a descendant, basically, of that line will not be sitting on the throne, thus far it's been kept. And if you follow the lines, I just showed you a list of rulers, and I'll keep building that list to map it out for you to show you that these very distinguishable lines, this line that I typed up will have mostly some kings of Frankish, kings of I believe there's probably 3 different lines of kings, but none of them are going to be classified as English. That will come from another line, and we'll see as the lines keep merging, especially with this, that if indeed the daughter of Zedekiah married a Malaysian king on the Isle of Ireland, then the breach that was between the Fares and Zara was brought back as one. But we have to investigate that to see whether or not that is true. Now, can you believe it? I have gone a second week bringing a book that I really want to read to you, but I'm out of time. So I'll have to save this one. Maybe I'll just start next week by no introduction, just start reading a book. And if you tune in while I'm reading, you'll be like, what's she talking about? You'll have to figure that one out. But what I want you to leave here with today is this. This is definitely not mythological fables. We're talking about really the Word of God, the destiny of His children, and the future of His children. Because I believe this, once we identify, and we'll look at the whole globe. Remember in earlier messages I talked to you about the Sake people going into India and going into China, and we'll find that they're going to be all over the world, except they're not going to know themselves as who they are. They're not going to remember. Their language will change. Even their looks eventually will change. But one thing does not change when we're following DNA. Now, DNA may be interwoven, may be mingled, a lot of things over time, but if we're going to older sources, that DNA is still sorting out the mess for us. And I think what we're going to see is when you get to the end of this, not only is God faithful to His Word to make good on what He said, but look at what's happening in the world today, where it seems like you don't have to be a furball and a tuatha de danann to hate your brother. You just walk around and everybody's full of it. Everybody's full of hate. They're full of animosity. Everybody's angry. Everybody's been divided. And I'm not telling you, listen, I am not saying that we can all get along, we can all hold hands, and let's all sing Kumbaya. That hasn't happened, and it probably will never happen except in a future time when the earth is recreated, perhaps, and Christ is ruling and reigning. But in the meantime, it should bring us to think of something. You really don't know. You really don't know who's sitting beside you. You're riding a bus, who's sitting beside you in the bus, or you're in a plane. You have no clue that that person may be a complete stranger in your eyes, but before God, God looking on, seeing 25 generations removed of a same tribe. And you and I would never know it. Does it make a difference in the big picture? For me, it does. I think that knowing there's not this idea somehow that, as I said, we're not all going to get along, that's never going to happen. But knowing that we're not as distinct as we think we are. And just to even give this a little bit more perspective, the people who spend most of their time in this land, by the way, it's rampant everywhere, but creating the division, if you fall for it and you let yourself be sucked into it, then you're a sucker yourself. Your only defense is to keep looking to Christ and recognize that Christ sees you the same way He sees the person sitting beside you, covered by His red shed blood that He spilled for you and for me. And He's not looking at who has more, who has less, who has standing. And for the people who are the organizers, the epitome of evil, the organizers of all of this evil that's happened in our land, if you don't think, it may not happen in our lifetime, but if you don't think they're going to get theirs, they will. We have become so fragmented, and that's why this subject to me, it's actually tugging on my heart more and more to see how interconnected we really are. And when you start probing the origins of these people, you realize that much of what we see around us was brought into our being by some of these people. And as I said, don't think that you know the answer of who will be there when God gives the clarion call for those people to come in that day to worship on the mount. To not be surprised at who shows up, at who may have had the revelation. I believe that. You know, I believe that God will reveal at that time the origins of things, including where we all, if you believe in creation, of course, Adam and Eve, but to what line, to where did people come from, and how did we end up where we are? And did we just end up here because God's just bored now, or do we all have a distinct purpose? And I choose to believe we have a distinct purpose, some different, some more, some less, but we all have a distinct purpose for being here. Let God's word sort it out, and where God's word leaves off, this is what we're doing to put the pieces together to show there is great reason to trust God in all things, not just on the things closed in this book, but the things that are yet to come. That's my message. I'm Pastor Melissa Scott, pastor of Faith Center, Glendale, California. I teach every Sunday morning at 11 a.m. If you'd like to attend services with us, simply call the 800 number, that is 800-338-3030, to join us. If you'd like to watch, listen, and learn 24 hours a day, simply log on to our website at www.pastormelissascott.com.